There are two things every podcast needs in order to grow. And oftentimes, so many podcasters promote on social media, invite high-profile guests onto their shows, scream at the top of their lungs to check out my podcast, mail their list, and publish great content for years, only to be stuck with slow and steady podcast growth. And the reason comes down to these two fundamental things. Number one, how the podcast is positioned, meaning who is the show for, what is the specific problem you're looking to solve with the podcast, and finally, what makes the show different compared to the thousands of other podcasts out there. And number two, how is the show packaged and presented in a way that's wildly attractive to the listeners you want to reach, meaning your podcast cover art, your episode titles, your show description, your show notes, all of the elements a new listener would look at, i.e. they see your cover art, or they see your title, or they see episode titles, or your show description. Those elements are the packaging of the show, the thing you're hoping gets them to stop and click play on your episode. If you think about it like this, let's say you're deciding to open a restaurant, right? The positioning side of the restaurant is really just deciding what kind of restaurant you're opening in the first place. Is it a vegan cafe for health conscious people? Or is it a burger joint for late night college students? And then the packaging is the menu design, the logo, the actual restaurant name, how you decide to describe your restaurant on Google listing, the plating of the food and what the outside looks like. Because you could have, let's say, amazing food, aka amazing podcast content, but if the restaurant looks confusing, unclear, a little bit vague, or if your menu is a complete mess, people won't walk in and they'll walk right past. Now, here's the thing, right? Most podcasters stress so much when it comes to their show's packaging. They have incredible cover art that looks amazing for the most part, not always, but for the most part. They have show names that sound cool. They have descriptions that are filled out, and they have episode and target high-profile guests, but they skip the most fundamental step, which is their podcast positioning. Who is their show for? What specific problem are they looking to solve with their podcast? And what makes their podcast different from everyone else? This is the starting point. So when they skip this fundamental step and they go out there and do all this marketing effort, promoting on social media, inviting high-profile guests into their podcast, it inevitably doesn't work and the podcast doesn't grow. But why does this happen? I did some digging and I found there was a fundamental shift that happens with 100% of the clients we work with that then leads them to finally break past their current podcast plateau and experience much faster growth. Now, this was the trend I spotted. The biggest difference to these podcasters breaking past their plateau was finally getting crystal clear on who their podcast was for. Now, I know this sounds pretty silly, the fact that you can be a podcaster who's been podcasting for, let's say, years, and let's say you have 50, 100, maybe even 200 podcast episodes. A lot of our clients, both new and experienced, even though they had hundreds of episodes, it sounds a bit silly to think that they weren't clear on who their show was for. But this problem is like a virus, and I see it everywhere. We've literally audited thousands of podcasts, and this trend of podcasters who are plateaued, unable to grow, there's always a link back to the fact that they're never super clear on who their show is for. Now, you might be thinking, well, what are some signs? Maybe you're someone who's wondered and was curious whether your show is specific enough or clear enough. Or maybe you're thinking that your podcast targeting needs to become way more specific. Well, I want to show you some very clear signs that'll help you identify whether or not you're making this exact same mistake, and later on I'll show you exactly why not having a clear positioning is completely screwing your chances of growing and monetizing way faster. Who is your show actually for? If you can't describe your ideal listener in one sentence, you might be way too broad. That's the first thing. The second is this: what specific problem does your podcast solve for your audience? If your answer feels vague, like helping people live better lives, or it's for everyone and it's fun and everyone can gain value from this, the likelihood is you're not targeting a clear enough niche. Would listeners describe your show the same way you would? If different people interpret your podcast in totally different ways, you might be lacking, once again, a clear positioning. Can you predict what topics your audience will care about before you actually create them? So if you feel like you're just guessing or talking about different topics each week and you don't have a very clear content strategy, i.e. you know exactly what to talk about in order to attract the listeners you want to reach, the likelihood is you don't have a strong enough listener profile, meaning a target audience. When you promote your podcast, you sometimes just struggle to know what to say to get people to take action. If you're finding it hard to create compelling hooks, you may not have a well-defined target audience. Do you rely on guests in order to attract listeners to your show instead of your own content? Yes, that's right. You can actually grow your podcast simply by the specific content you cover on the show. The content is the attraction piece that gets new listeners to your show. But if you find that you're constantly relying on high-profile guests to bring in their audience to your show, it's a sign that your podcast doesn't have a clear identity. Are your downloads stagnant despite you creating more content? It's likely because your podcast isn't speaking directly to a well-defined listener. Because if it was, and every single episode was highly relevant and targeted to your audience's needs, their wants, their pain points, and positioned as a solution, they're going to keep coming back for more. They'll keep binging your content. The show will grow month after month after month. So look, here's why having an unclear positioning with your podcast is a massive problem and bottleneck for your business. At the core of it, podcast growth happens when the right person finds your podcast, connects with it, and sticks around long term. And if your podcast doesn't have a clear podcast targeting or a super focused content strategy, none of this can happen. Now here's why. So reason number one, people pay attention to what feels relevant to them. Now, imagine, for example, you're walking through a crowded street filled with tons of billboard. Your brain automatically, basically instantly, will ignore most of the billboards you see and only spot the ones that actually feel relevant to you. So if the billboard, let's say, is vague, confusing, or is trying to sell you everything at once, you don't stop. You just keep walking by and you almost never even realize it was a thing that was there in the first place. And the reason is simple, right? People don't engage with messages that don't clearly address them. The same goes for your podcast. If your show is super broad or unclear, listeners don't feel like it's speaking to them, they'll simply scroll past it, they'll ignore it. If you're posting on social media but it's not clear who the podcast is for, why they would benefit, and what makes you so different compared to everyone else, why would they pay attention? They don't. So it gets ignored. Now, a great example of this was one of our clients called Bree. She joined us in a spot where she was kind of stuck and plateaued in terms of her growth, and her podcast was, again, unclear in terms of her targeting. She had a very general and very broad show all about relationships, and then we helped her become way more specific in terms of her positioning. She went from having a general broad podcast about relationships to a much more focused podcast that was targeting women who'd gone through toxic relationships from someone who was narcissistic. And you can see the title of both of those podcasts side by side. And when we had this clear positioning and then we presented and packaged the show in the right way, it now meant that when she promoted on social media, she grabbed the right listener's attention and was able to convert them into a first-time listener and a long-term fan with a focused content strategy. And this meant that when she promoted online, optimized her show for podcast SEO, the right listeners connected instantly with her podcast, felt like it was exactly what they needed. They clicked play and they started listening. And then reason number two, and again, this sounds so obvious, right? People only stick around when they know exactly what to expect, right? You know, when you open up Netflix, you expect to find shows that you like and binge an entire series. But if you just open up and flip up through random TV channels and you get inconsistent content, you don't stay for very long. You kind of get frustrated with the process. Now, again, the reason is simple. People only invest in things that feel predictable, valuable, and highly relevant to them right at this very moment. If your episodes feel super random, disconnected, all over the place, or overly reliant on guests, well, guess what? The guests are going to have their agenda. They're going to talk about what they want to talk about. New listeners won't binge your entire show because they came for the guest. They'll listen once and then move on. So here's why it's impossible to grow your podcast with these problems. No clear audience means nobody feels like the podcast was made for them, which leads to no one clicking and listening to the show. No focused content equals no reason for your listeners to keep coming back for more, which also equals no long-term growth. And the thing is, all of your marketing efforts, they don't work when you don't have a very clear message you're trying to send. Listener retention doesn't happen when you have a scattered content strategy. And monetization becomes impossible when you have a broad, unfocused audience who don't buy. You have to first fix these issues and then growth becomes easy. Because when your show speaks to a specific person with a very clear message and you create binge-worthy content, listeners will find you and they'll happily and gladly buy your stuff. Like our clients, Carl and John, who got super specific on their positioning, having their podcast titled Canadian Wealth Secrets. They were able to grow past 10,000 monthly downloads and were able to add $1 million to their pipeline simply because they, again, had a very clear positioning and then presented and packaged their show in the right way. Positioning first, and then the packaging. So now the question becomes, well, how can you get way more clear and specific on who exactly you should target as your podcast listener. That's exactly what I'm about to break down. Here are 4 simple frameworks to help you accomplish that. Here's the first thing that you can start to do. You can think about this from a problem expertise match framework. So the question really is, what specific problems are you best equipped to solve? Now, why this works? Well, the easiest way to pick your audience is to focus on a problem you can solve better than most people. That's a strong differentiator factor. If you're an expert in migraines and you have a general personal development podcast, but then you're competing against Tony Robbins and all these massive figures, but if you make a targeted podcast where it's specifically on migraines because you're a migraine expert and you know how to solve these problems, well, you're going to be the best person out there covering the topic about migraines on podcasts, right? It's important to note that listeners are actively searching for a solution. So if your show directly speaks to their pain points, it will attract the right people. Now, really, this is best for online coaches, consultants, experts with deep knowledge in a specific niche, and anyone who has helped other people solve a specific problem before. An example of this would be one of our clients, Laura, who grew past 17,000 monthly downloads. She is a communication expert and she helps introverted executives level up in their career, improve their leadership skills, as well as their communication skills. That's what a podcast does. She's been an expert in that for ages, and we recently helped her craft a new one-on-one coaching program. Normally she sells to corporate, does workshops, but now is doing more one-on-one, and she added $7,000 in profit over 14 days with a new coaching offer. So really, the target listener here is, meaning your audience, is people struggling with the exact problem you solve. Number 2, the transformation reflection framework. Ask yourself, what transformation have you personally gone through that others love to learn about? Now, why this works is because your audience is often the past version of you in this scenario. If you've gone through a major transformation in business, health, mindset, there are other people probably stuck where you used to be stuck, and they would love to learn from someone who's been there and figured it out, and then you give them the roadmap of how you solve those problems. This is best for if you're trying to build a personal brand, you're a personal or self-development coach, or an entrepreneur who's gone through major transformation. People who have built their success by overcoming challenges that others still face, which basically can be everyone, right? But you have to really pick which one of these you resonate most with. An example of this would be one of our clients called Sheridan. She scaled her business, and one of the methods she used to scale her business was really managing her anxiety and her stress through specific embodiments, so like somatic exercises. So her podcast was all about the embodied entrepreneur, and she spoke about somatic exercises and targeting people who wanted to build an anxiety-free business. She was helping a younger version of herself solve the problem that she had to solve during her own journey. And for her, she added $12,000 in profit through her podcast in 30 days using the podcast to attract high-ticket clients for a business. Now, again, the listener here is simply, right, people who are currently where you used to be before your transformation. And then we have the data-driven audience framework. So ask yourself the question of, what is the best performing episodes that I've put out? Right? Now, why this works is because your audience is already telling you what they care about. You just need to pay attention. Your best performing episodes gives you clear data on what resonates with your audience. If certain topics, formats, or guests drive massive engagement, just simply double down on those. So within the Get More Listeners Academy, which is our one-on-one private podcast growth and monetization program, we really stress the importance of looking at your podcast analytics, analyzing the top performing episodes. So if you have a general podcast about personal development, but you talk about anxiety, stress management, and like another topic, right? And you do an analysis and you figure out like, oh, okay, stress management works super well, my audience love it. Then you can just double down on that based on the data you already have. This is much better if you have a much bigger audience, over 5,000 to 10,000 monthly downloads. Anything smaller, the data can be a bit skewed. For example, if your solo episodes on productivity outperform guest interviews, your audience prefers you as the expert. If your episodes on making money online drive more listens, your audience wants business strategies, not general self-help. If your guest interviews with female founders outperforms others, your audience might be female in entrepreneurship. And here, of course, the audience is simply people who engage most with your most popular content. And then finally, the dream client model framework. The question is your goal to attract dream clients to your business? If so, Model your target listener based on your ideal client. So why this works is if your podcast is meant to again attract clients to your business, don't overthink it, right? Just design your podcast to speak direct to the people you want to work with. If you're unsure who to target, just look through your client list of who's really paying you the most and has benefited the most from your strategies. That's the sweet spot. These are the people who see the most value out of what you do and again are willing to pay you what you're worth. An example of this would be our own podcast. We've generated $120,000 in profit in the last 9 months from our own show while your podcast isn't growing. Our clients are entrepreneurs and experts who want to grow their podcast that builds a personal brand and attracts dream clients to their business. And we just frame the podcast to attract that specific avatar. So look, for us, we encourage our clients to focus on point number 4. And I would encourage you to do the exact same if you're in a situation where you want to grow a podcast that builds your personal brand and attracts dream clients to your business. And then once you have this, you'll have a much clearer positioning. You know who your show is for, and your marketing efforts become way more effective. Then you look at your packaging. How do you present the podcast in a wildly attractive way in order to attract the listeners you're trying to reach? That means having a wildly attractive podcast cover art that resonate with that listener. That means having episode title and a content strategy that's hyper focused on attracting, nurturing, and converting those listeners. It means having an irresistible show description that talks to the specific pain points of the listener you're trying to reach. It means having your show notes speaking to the desires and the needs of the audience you're trying to attract. It means knowing what keywords to rank for based on the keywords your audience will be searching in on Apple and Spotify to find your type of show. My point being, you have to get clear in your positioning first and then package the show in a way that attracts the listeners you want to reach. If you just focus on presenting your podcast as the best thing ever, but you don't actually know who you want to reach for your podcast, how can you be annoyed when people don't come flooding listening to your show? But when you finally get clear on your positioning and you have that clear targeting, everything else falls in place. Your marketing becomes way easier and you'll know exactly what to say. Your content becomes way more bingeable and listeners start to feel like it was precisely made for them, because it was. Monetization happens naturally because you're speaking to the problems and pain points people are willing to pay for. Your position as the expert your listeners need in order to solve those specific problems. So who exactly are you trying to reach with your podcast? Once you nail this, growth becomes inevitable. So with that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.